For 6 weeks, my daughter-in-law Emily didn't answer a single call. The day I finally used my spare key, the first thing I saw was that her roses were dead. Emily Carter loved those roses more than anything in that house. She once told me they reminded her of the small garden her mother kept behind their old home in Oregon, the kind of place where the air always smelled like rain and soil. Emily watered those roses every morning before work and every evening before dinner, like clockwork. I know because she used to call me sometimes while she stood outside with the hose in her hand, telling me about a new bud that had opened overnight or a stubborn patch of aphids she had finally managed to get rid of. That's why the sight stopped me cold the moment I stepped through the front gate. The bushes lining the walkway were dry, their leaves curling inward like they had been forgotten under a hot summer sun. It was early September, and the afternoon air in suburban Illinois still carried that lingering warmth that settles over the neighborhood around 3 o'clock, when school buses have already come and gone and most people are still at work. The Carter house sat quiet at the end of Maplewood Drive, the same tidy street where my son Daniel had insisted on buying his first home 8 years ago. Back then he told me it was the perfect place to start a family. I remember standing right where I stood now, admiring the fresh paint on the porch railings while Emily planted those very roses along the walkway. She had knelt in the dirt with a pair of bright yellow gardening gloves, carefully patting the soil around each root as if she were tucking something fragile safely into bed. Emily had always been that way. Careful, attentive, the kind of woman who noticed the small things most people overlooked. So when 6 weeks passed without a single call from her, I knew something was wrong long before Daniel admitted it. The first week, he told me she was busy with work. The second week, he said she had taken a short trip to visit a friend. By the fourth week, his answers had grown shorter, like each conversation with me was something he wanted to end as quickly as possible. That alone would have been strange enough, but Daniel had never been good at hiding anything. As a boy, he couldn't even keep a Christmas present secret for more than a day without giving himself away with that same nervous half-smile he still had as an adult. The last time I asked about Emily, his voice tightened just slightly over the phone. "She's fine, Mom," he said. "Just busy." Busy. That was the word he used every time. But Emily Carter was not the kind of woman who disappeared quietly for 6 weeks without telling anyone, especially not the woman who used to call me every Sunday afternoon to ask how my knees were doing or whether the tomatoes in my backyard garden had finally ripened. I stood there at the edge of the walkway, looking down at the brittle rose petals scattered along the ground like tiny pieces of faded paper. The mailbox by the curb was stuffed with envelopes, some of them hanging halfway out of the slot. That was the second thing that didn't make sense. Emily hated letting mail pile up. She once drove across town during a thunderstorm just to bring in a package Daniel had forgotten on the porch. I remember laughing at her then, telling her it would still be there in the morning. She just smiled and said she liked knowing everything in the house was taken care of. Now nothing looked taken care of. The curtains in the living room windows were closed tight, even though the day was bright outside. The wind chime Emily had hung near the front door swayed slightly in the breeze, tapping together with a soft hollow sound that seemed too loud in the stillness of the yard. I reached into my purse and felt the cool metal of the spare key Daniel had given me years ago just in case. Back then it had felt like a small gesture of trust between family members. Standing there now, it felt like the only thing connecting me to whatever had happened inside that house. I walked slowly up the steps to the porch, each one creaking the same way it always had, and paused with my hand resting against the front door. The roses behind me rustled softly in the wind. Emily never let her roses die, not once in all the years she had lived there, and yet every single bush along that walkway had turned brown. That was the moment I realized something in that house had been wrong for a very long time. I stood there for another moment with the spare key resting in my palm, listening to the quiet of the street behind me. Maplewood Drive had always been a peaceful neighborhood, the kind of place where the loudest sound most afternoons was a lawnmower 2 houses away or a dog barking somewhere behind a fence. But that afternoon the silence felt heavier than usual, like the whole street had paused without telling me why. I slid the key slowly into the lock and turned it. The door opened with a soft click, the same familiar sound I had heard countless times during family dinners and holiday visits. The air inside the house felt still, almost stale, like a room that had not been opened in days. Emily used to keep the windows cracked just a little during the fall so fresh air could move through the living room. She once told me a house needed to breathe the same way people did. Now the air felt trapped. I stepped inside and closed the door gently behind me. The living room looked almost exactly the same as the last time I had visited in early July. The pale blue sofa sat beneath the front window, the throw blanket Emily knitted during one long winter draped neatly over the arm. The coffee table still held the same stack of gardening magazines she liked to read on Sunday mornings while Daniel watched football. Nothing was overturned. Nothing looked broken. And yet something about the room felt unfinished, as if someone had stood up in the middle of a quiet afternoon and never returned to sit back down. My eyes moved slowly around the space, noticing the little details Emily always cared about. The framed photograph from their trip to Colorado still sat on the bookshelf beside the fireplace. In the picture, Emily was laughing at something Daniel had said while they stood near a trail covered in golden autumn leaves. That had been 2 years ago. I remember because she mailed me a postcard from that trip with a note that said the mountains made her feel peaceful. The kitchen sat just beyond the living room, visible through the open doorway. I walked toward it carefully, the hardwood floor creaking softly beneath my shoes. Emily kept her kitchen spotless. Every jar in the pantry was labeled. Every dish was washed before bedtime. But the moment I stepped through the doorway, I saw something that made my chest tighten slightly. A mug sat in the sink beside the faucet. It was the white ceramic mug with a tiny painted rose on the side, the one I gave Emily 3 Christmases ago. A thin ring of dried coffee clung to the inside. Emily never left dishes in the sink overnight. Not once in all the years I had known her. I moved closer to the counter and looked around the room. The refrigerator hummed quietly in the corner. A calendar hung beside it, the same paper calendar Emily used to track watering days for the garden. Several dates in August were circled in green pen. I stepped closer and read the small notes written beside them. Water roses. Trim stems. Fertilize soil. The last note was dated 6 weeks ago. After that, the pages were blank. I opened the refrigerator slowly, half expecting to see groceries neatly arranged the way Emily always kept them. Instead, I found only a few items sitting on the shelves. A carton of milk that had already expired. A small container of strawberries that had begun to wrinkle and darken. Emily never wasted food. She planned every meal for the week with careful lists and color-coded notes. Standing there in the quiet kitchen, I began to feel a slow uneasiness spreading through my chest. Nothing in the house looked damaged. Nothing looked disturbed. And yet everything felt abandoned in the smallest possible way, like a life that had quietly paused without warning. I closed the refrigerator door and rested my hand against the kitchen counter for a moment, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Daniel said Emily had gone on a trip. But Emily Carter was not the kind of woman who left her house, her garden, and her life sitting exactly where she left them. Not for 6 weeks. Not without telling anyone where she was going. I stood quietly in the kitchen for a moment longer, letting my eyes travel across the familiar countertops and cabinets Emily had always kept so carefully organized. The small digital clock on the microwave read 3:27 in the afternoon, its green numbers glowing softly in the dim light. Emily preferred natural light during the day, so she rarely turned on the overhead lamps unless the sun had already gone down. But the curtains above the sink were drawn halfway closed, allowing only a narrow strip of sunlight to fall across the counter. Dust floated slowly through that beam of light, drifting lazily as if time inside the house had slowed down without anyone noticing. I moved toward the hallway that led deeper into the house, my steps instinctively quiet. The hallway walls were lined with framed photographs, many of them taken during family gatherings over the years. There was one from Thanksgiving 4 years ago, where Emily stood beside Daniel at the dining table, holding a pie she had baked from scratch. I remembered that evening clearly because she had spent nearly 3 hours preparing the meal, carefully timing every dish so that everything would be ready at the exact same moment. Emily believed meals were a way of holding a family together. She once told me that when people sat down at the same table, they remembered who they belonged to. I paused in front of the photograph for a moment before continuing down the hall. The bedroom door stood slightly open. I pushed it gently with my fingertips and stepped inside. The room looked as though it had been tidied earlier that morning. The bed was made neatly with the pale gray quilt Emily liked, and the pillows were arranged in the same precise order she always used. A small vase sat on the nightstand beside the bed, though the flowers inside had long since dried and curled inward. Emily changed those flowers every week, usually roses from the garden out front. The closet door stood open across the room, and I walked toward it slowly. Most of the clothing still hung in place along the rack, arranged by color the way Emily preferred. Light blouses near the front, dark jackets toward the back. But as I looked closer, I noticed a few empty spaces where hangers should have been. Not many, just enough to suggest that someone had taken a few things and left the rest behind. That detail alone did not make sense to me. Emily was the type of woman who packed carefully when she traveled. She made lists. She folded clothes neatly into suitcases and always remembered to bring an extra sweater, even in the middle of summer. If she had left for a trip, the closet would have looked very different. I stepped back into the hallway and walked toward the small office room Daniel used for work at the end of the corridor. The door was closed, which was unusual because Daniel typically left it open unless he was on a call. I turned the handle and pushed the door slowly inward. The office smelled faintly of paper and printer ink. Daniel's desk sat against the far wall beneath a window that looked out toward the backyard. His laptop was closed, resting exactly in the center of the desk, with a stack of unopened envelopes placed beside it. I moved closer and glanced down at the return addresses printed on the corners of the envelopes. Most of them came from banks or financial offices, the kind of mail people usually open right away. Daniel had always been careful with money matters, almost to the point of obsession. Seeing those letters sitting there untouched made the quiet uneasiness inside me grow stronger. I turned toward the window and looked out across the backyard. The grass had grown slightly taller than usual, and the small wooden bench Emily had placed near the fence sat empty beneath the shade of a maple tree. That bench was where she often sat in the evenings after watering the garden, watching the sunlight fade across the yard while Daniel finished work inside. From where I stood, I could see the back corner of the rose garden that wrapped around the side of the house. The bushes there were just as dry as the ones in the front yard. The longer I stood inside that silent house, the more a simple truth began to settle quietly in my mind. People do not leave their lives behind this way. Not someone like Emily Carter. Not without a reason no one had explained to me yet. I remained standing in Daniel's office for several seconds, looking out across the quiet backyard as the late afternoon light stretched long shadows over the grass. The maple tree near the fence had already begun turning the faintest shade of orange, a sign that autumn would arrive soon in Illinois. Emily loved this time of year. She once told me fall felt honest to her, because nothing tried to pretend it would last forever. Leaves changed. Gardens faded. People slowed down and gathered indoors again. I could almost hear her voice saying those words as I stood there, remembering the way she would lean against that wooden bench outside with a cup of tea in her hands. Emily had always been thoughtful in a quiet kind of way. Not dramatic. Not impulsive. The kind of person who considered things carefully before making a decision. That was why the past 6 weeks made so little sense to me. As I walked back through the hallway, my mind drifted to the last conversation I had with her. It had been early on a Sunday evening, just after dinner. I had been sitting on my back porch watching the fireflies appear over my own small garden when my phone rang. Emily's voice sounded softer than usual that night, though at the time I could not quite explain why. She asked how my tomatoes were doing and whether the weather had been warm enough for the peppers to ripen. We talked about ordinary things for a few minutes, the sort of small conversation people share when they care about one another's lives. But toward the end of the call there had been a pause, a quiet moment that felt slightly heavier than the rest. Emily asked me a question that had stayed with me ever since. She said, "Margaret, can I ask you something strange?" I laughed and told her she could ask anything she liked. Then she said, "If someone discovers something unexpected about their marriage, something involving money or decisions that were not shared honestly, what do you think they should do?" At the time I assumed she was asking for general advice, the kind people sometimes wonder about after reading an article or hearing a story from a friend. I told her the same thing I have believed for many years. I said honesty is always the safest place to begin, even when the truth feels uncomfortable. Emily thanked me quietly after that and said she would keep that in mind. The conversation ended normally. She wished me a good night and told me she would call again soon. That was the last time I heard her voice. Standing in the hallway now, I realized how different that conversation sounded in my memory. Emily had not been curious that evening. She had sounded concerned, thoughtful in a way that suggested she was working through something difficult in her mind. I stepped slowly toward the front of the house again, glancing once more at the stack of unopened mail on the table near the door. 6 weeks is a long time for silence to grow between people who used to speak regularly. Long enough for small questions to become larger ones. Daniel had insisted everything was fine each time I asked about her. Yet the quiet house around me told a different story. The carefully arranged rooms, the untouched calendar, the forgotten roses outside, all of it suggested a life that had paused suddenly in the middle of an ordinary day. I reached for my phone and looked at Daniel's name in my contacts list, considering whether to call him again. But something inside me hesitated. If there was an explanation for Emily's absence, it had not been shared with me honestly so far. And the longer I stood inside that silent house, the more certain I became that the truth was not waiting in a phone conversation. It was waiting somewhere inside the pieces of Emily's life that had been left behind. I slipped my phone back into my purse without calling Daniel. Something about the stillness of the house told me that rushing to ask questions would not give me the answers I needed. Instead, I began walking slowly through the living room again, this time paying closer attention to the smaller details that most people might overlook. Emily believed small things often revealed the truth of a situation long before anyone spoke about it. She once said you could tell what kind of day someone had by the way they left their kitchen counter. That thought stayed with me as I moved toward the small side table beside the sofa. A stack of mail rested there as well, separate from the pile near the front door. Most of it appeared to be ordinary household envelopes, utility bills, grocery coupons, a gardening catalog Emily had once told me she loved because it carried heirloom seeds that were difficult to find anywhere else. I lifted the catalog gently and noticed something tucked underneath it. A thin notepad with Emily's handwriting across the top page. Her writing was always neat and rounded, the kind of careful script that came from someone who liked things to be orderly. The page held a short list written in blue ink. Pick up soil nutrients. Check bank statement. Call attorney on Tuesday. I read the last line twice before setting the notepad back on the table. Emily had never mentioned anything about an attorney during our last conversation. That alone might not have meant much if it were not for the question she had asked me that evening about honesty and money in a marriage. I stood there quietly for a moment, letting the thought settle in my mind. Then I walked toward the dining room, which sat just beyond the living room archway. The dining table looked exactly the way Emily usually left it after tidying up from dinner. 4 chairs pushed neatly into place. A small bowl of decorative stones in the center. But there was one detail that caught my attention immediately. A folder rested near the far end of the table, partially hidden beneath a folded placemat. I moved closer and slid the folder gently toward me. Inside were several printed documents arranged carefully together. Bank statements, a few receipts, and a single envelope with Daniel's name written across the front in Emily's handwriting. The envelope was not sealed. I hesitated for a moment before opening it, unsure whether I should read something that had clearly been meant for my son. But 6 weeks of silence had already crossed a line that made ordinary boundaries feel less certain. I removed the paper inside and unfolded it slowly. The letter was not long. Emily had written only a few paragraphs, each line steady and calm in the same neat handwriting I recognized so well. She explained that she had recently discovered several financial transfers between accounts that she did not recognize. She wrote that she had asked Daniel about them, but had not received clear answers. She said she planned to speak with a lawyer to understand her rights before making any decisions. The final line of the letter was the one that stayed with me the longest. It said that honesty was the foundation of every home, and once that foundation begins to crack, it becomes impossible to ignore. I placed the letter back inside the folder and rested my hands against the edge of the table. Outside, a car passed slowly along Maplewood Drive, its tires humming softly against the pavement before the sound faded again. Emily had not disappeared without reason. That much was becoming clear. The quiet house around me was not simply waiting for her return. It was holding the pieces of a story that had not yet been fully understood. I stood beside the dining table for a long moment after reading Emily's letter, listening to the quiet hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen and the distant sound of a lawn mower somewhere down Maplewood Drive. The house felt different now that I knew Emily had been searching for answers before she disappeared. Not frightened exactly, but unsettled in a quiet way, like a room where someone had started an important conversation and then walked away before finishing it. I placed the letter carefully back into the folder and closed it, sliding the papers together the way Emily had arranged them. She had always been methodical when it came to anything involving money or paperwork. Even during holiday dinners, she kept small lists in her purse to remind herself which bills were due at the end of the week. That habit had once made Daniel laugh. He used to say Emily treated a household budget the same way an accountant treated a business ledger. But standing there now, I realized those habits had probably helped her notice details that might have escaped someone else's attention. I carried the folder with me into the office at the end of the hallway and set it gently on Daniel's desk beside the unopened envelopes. The afternoon light coming through the window had shifted slightly lower in the sky, casting long, narrow shadows across the wooden floor. I sat down in Daniel's chair and looked at the envelopes again, reading the return addresses more carefully this time. Several of them came from financial institutions I recognized. Others were from places I did not. One envelope in particular caught my attention because it had been opened and then folded closed again without being placed back inside the stack neatly. I slid the paper out and unfolded it slowly. It was a printed notice confirming a transfer between two accounts, dated nearly 7 weeks earlier. The amount listed on the document was larger than I expected to see in ordinary household finances. I read the numbers twice before setting the paper down again. Emily had written that she discovered financial transfers she did not recognize. This must have been one of them. I leaned back slightly in the chair, letting my eyes drift toward the window again. The backyard remained quiet, the maple leaves shifting gently in the early evening breeze. Daniel had always been ambitious when it came to money. Even as a teenager, he talked about investments and business opportunities the way other boys talked about sports. I had admired that determination once. But ambition can sometimes make people impatient with the ordinary rhythms of life, and Emily had always preferred steady things. Gardens that grew slowly, budgets that balanced, homes that felt secure. I stood up again and looked across the desk once more. The laptop sat closed exactly where Daniel had left it. I did not attempt to open it. Instead, I gathered the bank notice and Emily's folder together and placed them side by side, studying the dates printed across the pages. The timeline formed a quiet pattern when viewed all at once. The financial transfer had occurred first. Emily's note about calling an attorney appeared shortly after that. And then, only days later, her calls to me had stopped completely. I rested my hand against the desk and felt the smooth surface beneath my fingertips. 6 weeks earlier, something had changed inside this house. Not suddenly, not loudly, but clearly enough that Emily had begun searching for the truth. And if she had felt the need to seek legal advice before speaking openly about it, then whatever she discovered had been serious enough to make her cautious. I walked slowly back toward the living room again, the quiet weight of that realization settling deeper with each step. The empty rooms around me no longer felt simply abandoned. They felt like the aftermath of a decision that had already been made, one that had quietly reshaped everything Emily thought she knew about her own home. I stood in the living room again with the folder resting lightly in my hands, feeling the quiet weight of the papers inside. Outside, the sunlight had shifted lower toward the rooftops across Maplewood Drive, and the long shadows stretching through the front windows made the house feel even more still than before. I walked slowly to the sofa and sat down, placing the folder on the coffee table in front of me. For several minutes I simply listened to the house. The soft hum of the refrigerator down the hallway. The faint tapping of the wind chime on the porch as the breeze moved through it. Houses that are lived in usually carry a certain kind of noise. Cabinets opening. Footsteps upstairs. The small movements of everyday life. But this house had none of that. It felt paused, like a photograph taken in the middle of a moment that had never finished unfolding. I opened the folder again and studied the dates written across the bank statements. The transfers Emily had noticed began about 2 months earlier. Small at first, then gradually larger. The pattern suggested someone had been moving money carefully, hoping the changes would not be noticed all at once. Emily had clearly noticed. That was why she wrote the letter to Daniel. And that was why she had planned to speak with an attorney. I leaned back against the sofa and tried to imagine the conversation that might have followed. Emily sitting at this very table, asking calm but direct questions. Daniel standing across from her, explaining or perhaps avoiding the explanation entirely. My son had never been comfortable when someone challenged his decisions. Even as a child, he preferred to solve problems on his own terms. When teachers asked too many questions, he often grew quiet rather than argumentative. That same quiet habit had followed him into adulthood. But Emily was not the kind of woman who ignored uncertainty once she recognized it. She believed in understanding things clearly. The sunlight shifted again across the floor as I closed the folder and rested my hands on the table. My eyes drifted toward the staircase leading to the second floor. Emily rarely used the upstairs rooms except when guests visited, but something about the stillness of the house made me feel as though I had not yet seen everything I needed to see. I stood slowly and walked toward the stairs. Each step creaked softly beneath my weight, the familiar sound echoing lightly against the hallway walls. The upstairs hallway was dim, lit only by the soft glow of daylight coming through a narrow window at the far end. The guest bedroom door stood open. Inside, the bed was neatly made and the curtains drawn halfway closed, exactly the way Emily usually left the room after preparing it for visitors. Nothing appeared disturbed. I continued down the hallway toward the small storage room at the end. Emily sometimes kept extra gardening tools there during the winter months. The door was slightly ajar. I pushed it open and glanced inside. Shelves lined the walls, filled with labeled boxes and neatly folded blankets. But on the small desk near the corner sat something that immediately caught my attention. A thin legal folder with a printed name across the tab. I stepped closer and read the label carefully. The name belonged to a local law office located only 15 minutes from Maplewood Drive. Inside the folder were appointment confirmations dated just a few days before Emily stopped calling me. The quiet pieces of the story were beginning to fit together now. Emily had not been ignoring the changes in her home. She had been preparing to understand them. And whatever she discovered during those last few days had been important enough to make her leave everything else behind. I carried the legal folder downstairs with me and placed it on the dining table beside Emily's earlier papers. The quiet of the house felt heavier now that the pieces of her last few days were beginning to take shape in my mind. Emily had not simply noticed unusual financial activity. She had taken careful steps to understand it. She gathered documents. She wrote notes. She scheduled a meeting with a lawyer only a short drive from the house. None of those actions belonged to someone acting on impulse. Emily planned things slowly, the same way she planned her garden each spring. First the soil, then the seeds, then patience. I sat down again at the table and opened the legal folder, reading the printed appointment confirmation more carefully this time. The meeting had been scheduled for a Tuesday morning at 9:30. 3 days later, she had called me on Sunday evening and asked that quiet question about honesty in a marriage. The timeline settled into place like the final pieces of a puzzle sliding gently together. Emily had already discovered something serious by the time she spoke with me. Something important enough that she wanted legal advice before confronting it directly. I folded the confirmation back into the folder and looked around the dining room once more. The house did not feel abandoned in the ordinary sense. It felt paused, as though Emily had stepped away briefly while deciding what to do next. I stood and walked toward the front window, pulling the curtains slightly aside to look out across Maplewood Drive. A delivery truck moved slowly down the street, stopping 2 houses away before continuing toward the corner. Ordinary life carried on outside the house without noticing the quiet mystery sitting inside these walls. My thoughts returned to Daniel. When I had asked about Emily during our last few phone conversations, his answers had been brief and calm. Too calm, perhaps. He told me she was traveling. He said she needed some time to think. But he had never mentioned anything about a disagreement or financial questions. If Emily had confronted him after meeting with the lawyer, that conversation might have changed everything between them. I returned to the table and studied the bank statements again, tracing the sequence of transfers with my finger. The amounts increased gradually over several weeks, moving between accounts that appeared connected to Daniel's name. Emily had noticed the pattern early enough to begin asking questions. That meant she had likely seen something in these documents that troubled her deeply. I closed the folder slowly and rested my hands on the tabletop. The house was quiet enough that I could hear the soft ticking of the wall clock in the kitchen. Each second sounded clear and deliberate, marking the passage of time that had gone unspoken during the past 6 weeks. Emily Carter was not the kind of woman who vanished from her own life without explanation. She had been searching for answers, gathering information carefully before taking the next step. And now I stood inside the home she had left behind, holding the very clues she had been studying. Whatever had happened here had not begun suddenly. It had unfolded quietly over time, hidden within ordinary details that only someone as attentive as Emily would notice. And if she had gone far enough to consult a lawyer before speaking openly about it, then the truth she discovered must have been something she believed could change the entire foundation of the life she shared with my son. I remained seated at the dining table for a long time after closing the folder, listening to the quiet ticking of the kitchen clock as the afternoon slowly faded into early evening. The light outside the windows had softened, turning the lawns along Maplewood Drive into long golden shapes that stretched toward the sidewalk. I gathered the papers carefully and placed them back inside the folder exactly the way Emily had arranged them. She had always believed that when you handle something important, you return it to its place with respect. That was the kind of person she was. Methodical, thoughtful, patient even when things became difficult. As I carried the folder toward the living room, I realized something else that had not been obvious earlier. Emily had not rushed when she began investigating the financial transfers. She had taken her time collecting information first. Bank statements, notes, appointment confirmations. That meant she wanted to understand the situation clearly before confronting Daniel about it. I set the folder on the coffee table again and looked around the quiet room one more time. The evening breeze outside had grown slightly stronger, and the wind chime on the porch moved with a gentle hollow sound that echoed faintly through the house. I walked toward the front door and opened it slowly, stepping out onto the porch. The air had cooled enough that I could smell the faint scent of dry leaves from the maple tree in the backyard. From the porch, I could see the rose bushes lining the walkway more clearly now in the fading sunlight. Their dry stems and curled petals looked fragile, as if they had been waiting patiently for someone to return and care for them again. Emily had once told me roses could survive difficult seasons if someone trimmed them back and watered the roots at the right time. They only truly failed when they were forgotten entirely. I stepped down from the porch and walked a few feet along the path, looking at the small garden beds she had planted so carefully. The soil was dry, but not ruined. With attention, it could grow again. That thought stayed with me as I turned back toward the house. Whatever had happened during those last weeks before Emily left, she had not abandoned her life without thought. She had been searching for the truth about something serious enough to challenge the trust inside her marriage. And once she began looking, she had continued until the answers became impossible to ignore. I stood at the edge of the walkway and looked once more at the quiet house behind me. The windows reflected the soft orange glow of the setting sun, giving the home a calm appearance that did not reveal any of the questions still lingering inside. Daniel believed Emily had simply disappeared from our lives. But the evidence she left behind told a different story. She had not vanished without purpose. She had stepped away after discovering something she needed time to understand and resolve on her own terms. I walked back toward my car at the curb, carrying the folder with me. The truth Emily had been uncovering during those final days was now resting in my hands, and I knew one thing with certainty as I opened the car door and looked once more at the silent house. This story was not finished yet. It had only just begun to reveal itself.